The Sengoku, or Warring States, period of Japanese history was a lawless time dominated by ruthless men. Local governors, daimyo, sent raiding parties into their neighbors' territories and suffered retaliatory attacks in return. Caught in the middle of all this were the commoners. Japanese peasants were alternately overtaxed and forced into battle against other reluctant farmers. Peasants were pushed to the breaking point, and then some of them began to push back. The word for these groups in Japanese is ikki, which is usually translated as uprising or revolt, but that doesn't quite describe what was happening. I'm going to dip into more recent history and use the term autonomous zone. The Saika-ikki, who were based in present-day Wakayama and Kainan, are a good example of what these ikki were able to accomplish. The Saika-ikki sent out trade missions and established relationships with other like-minded groups in the country. They even had a navy, flying under the flag of Yatagarasu, the three-legged crow. They were renowned for their gunnery skills. By the mid-16th century, guns were not exactly rare in Japan, but the Saika-ikki were incredibly well armed for such a small organization. Their leader was Saika Magoichi, from a local samurai family. This was not a man, but rather a title, like the Dread Pirate Roberts. The name Saika Magoichi was passed down within the family, but shoddy historical records have made it difficult to tell how many people actually took the name, or when it changed hands. It doesn't help that one of them faked his death at some point. Some sources claim that Magoichi was assassinated in 1582, while others say he's the same person the whole way through the story. Magoichi made the Saika-ikki famous when he allied with the Ikko-ikki. The Ikko-ikki were a radical sect of Buddhism not averse to violence, and warlord Oda Nobunaga saw them as a threat. In 1570, he besieged the sect's fortress-like temple of Ishiyama Hongan, in what is now Osaka. The Ikko-ikki's chief abbot, Kennyo, sent out a call for assistance to other nearby ikki groups. Magoichi sent 5,000 gunners to defend against Nobunaga's armies. They tormented the attackers with their well-crafted guns and deadly accuracy. Seven years into the siege, Nobunaga shifted tactics. He raised an army of 160,000 men, supposedly, and marched south into Ki, aiming to strike at the homes of the Ikko-ikki's allies. Nobunaga's men were in unfamiliar terrain, and their victories were hard-won, but Magoichi agreed to stop supporting Kennyo with arms and men, an agreement that he broke the minute Nobunaga's army was out of range. Nobunaga finally breached the temple's walls in 1580. He allowed his bitter rivals to leave with their lives, but he had the fortress itself burned to the ground. Atop its ashes, he built his headquarters of Osaka Castle, which was very much a deliberate fuck you to the monks. Kennyo, the head abbot of the temple, was taken in by the Saika-ikki. But by that point, Magoichi had seen which way the wind was blowing and switched allegiances to Nobunaga. However, only months after this, Nobunaga met with an untimely demise, leaving Magoichi alone and friendless. Once word of Nobunaga's death reached the Saika-ikki, Magoichi fled, joining up with Nobunaga's successor, Toyotomi Hideyoshi. In 1585, Hideyoshi invaded the peninsula. The Saika resisted the warlord at every turn, but theirs was a losing battle. They were quickly pushed back to their headquarters at Ota Castle for a final stand. What follows is one of the most ludicrous battles I've ever heard of. Hideyoshi knew from his predecessor's 10-year siege that attacking the castle directly would be costly and take time. So he tried something a little less conventional. The warlord had a large levee constructed around the castle, and then he diverted the river into it, slowly flooding the entire area. As if this wasn't enough, he then attacked the waterlogged castle with warships. But unbeknownst to the attackers, the Saika-ikki's talents were not limited to gunnery. They sent divers into the lake to bore holes into the bottoms of ships, and they sabotaged part of the levee, drowning hundreds of enemy soldiers. The landlocked Saika-ikki did better than you'd expect against a naval assault, but they were outnumbered 10-1 and morale was dropping. A month after the siege began, they surrendered. Their old friend Saika Magoichi served as a liaison between his new boss and his former organization. The vast majority of the warriors were allowed to disarm and leave unmolested, but 53 of the senior members were forced to commit suicide and buried near the castle. The castle itself was torched and never rebuilt, and the brave Saika-ikki gunners went back to their fields. Kenyo petitioned Hideyoshi for the right to rebuild his temple, and the warlord granted him a plot of land in Kyoto. Today, there are several subsidiary temples all over the country, like this one in Wakayama City. But nobody knows what happened to Saika Magoichi after the battle. His son, who also took the name Saika Magoichi, was a loyal vassal to Toyotomi Hideyoshi and trained the warlord's gunnery corps. So he may have lived with his son in Osaka, or he may have returned to his home in Saika, or he may have gone somewhere else entirely. It's difficult to tell what happened to a man with multiple gravestones. The Saika-ikki's fortresses have vanished about as completely as Saika Magoichi himself. The hill that Saika Castle was built on is a small island of nature in a large city, but the entire area that was flooded by Toyotomi Hideyoshi is a dense urban environment. The temple where Ota Castle once stood is a block away from a subway. And as hard as sub sandwiches are to come by in Japan, I really wish there was a little more to commemorate the time a bunch of well-armed peasants battled against warships from their flooded castle.